How did it even happen that a country which was once one of America's main allies in the Middle East turned into, perhaps, its bitterest enemy? Why were American flags burned in Tehran for decades? Why does Washington return to Iran again and again, as if it cannot close this story? And why is the conflict between the United States and Iran not just a dispute over oil, sanctions, or the nuclear program? Because in reality, this story goes much deeper. This is a story about how an ancient civilization first became a playground for foreign empires. Then it found oil beneath itself, and along with it, a curse. To understand why the United States and Iran became enemies, we need to go back not to 1979 and not to the era of the nuclear program. We need to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, to Iran, which back then was still more Persia than Iran for many people, to a country with a vast history but a very weak present. Imagine a map. The year is 1907. London. Two diplomats sit down at a table and divide a foreign country into pieces. The northern half goes to Russia, the southern half goes to Britain. In the middle, a buffer. Iran is not sitting at that table. Nobody asks it. Nobody apologizes. This is called the Anglo-Russian Convention, and it is signed calmly, as if the subject were warehouse space, not a country with a 3,000-year history. This is where we have to begin. Not with Khomeini, not with the Shah, not with 1979, with this map. Because this is exactly where the feeling is born that will later determine everything else. The feeling that others look at your country as an object, not as a people, but as a territory that can be divided, redrawn, and fitted into their own schemes. Iran back then was completely different from what it is today. The country was ruled by the Qajar dynasty, formally an independent monarchy. In reality, a vlast without money, without an army, and without real control over its own territory. The treasury was so empty that the Shahs literally sold concessions just to pay courtiers. In 1872, Nasser al-Din Shah granted the British Baron Julius Reuter rights to almost everything: railway construction, development of natural resources, and banking. Contemporaries called this deal the most complete surrender of sovereignty that a monarch could possibly make. Under public pressure, the concession was withdrawn, but that was a symptom, not an exception. To the north was Russia. Its interest in Persia was above all strategic. The Russian Empire had no access to a warm sea that did not freeze in winter. The Baltic froze. The White Sea froze. The Black Sea Straits were controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The only route to year-round ice-free waters lay through the south, through Persia to the Persian Gulf or to the Indian Ocean. This southern question was an obsessive idea of Russian geopolitics for almost 2 centuries. In addition, by that time Russia had already taken the Caucasus from Iran under the Treaty of Gulistan of 1813 and the Treaty of Turkmenchay of 1828. Persia lost Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Both wars ended catastrophically for it, and ever since the northern border was perceived as a chronic vulnerability. To the south was Britain. Its interest was different, but no less concrete. By 1800, India was giving the British Empire about 20% of all state revenues. It was the main colony, the main source of wealth, the main strategic asset. The route to India ran through the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf cannot be controlled without controlling the coastal territories. Iran, with its shoreline nearly 2,500 kilometers long, was exactly one of those territories. That is why, for London, Iran was not a state valuable in itself, but part of India's defensive perimeter. In the 1800s, the British were building a network of protectorates along the southern coast of Persia and the Arabian Peninsula, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, the Trucial States, precisely in order to control the sea route. Iran fit into the same logic. That is how Persia found itself in a position that diplomacy calls a buffer state, a country that exists not for itself, but so that two great powers do not collide directly. It is an honorable status only on paper. In practice, it means that your internal affairs are someone else's foreign policy. The Iranian elite understood this perfectly well. After the catastrophic defeats by Russia in the early 19th century, the Shah's court tried to play on the contradictions between the two empires. Ask the British for protection from the Russians, and the Russians for a counterweight to British pressure. The strategy was not without logic, but it had a fundamental flaw. Both players understood what was happening, and in the end, they preferred to come to terms with each other. That is exactly what happened in 1907. Britain and Russia signed the agreement on the division of spheres of influence in Persia. The north of the country, from Tehran to Tabriz, went to Russia. The southeast, covering the approaches to India, went to Britain. The central strip was declared neutral, which in practice meant accessible to both. The Iranian side was not invited to the negotiations. Sovereignty was not formally abolished, but that was the true substance of it. Two empires divided the country between themselves the way people divide rooms in a rented apartment, without asking the owner. The year is 1908, southwestern Persia, the Masjid Soliman area. The heat was so intense that it was impossible to sleep in a tent. So British Lieutenant Arnold Wilson lay down outside directly on the ground. But at 4 in the morning, he was awakened by sharp cries. Wilson woke up and saw a fountain of oil bursting out of the ground 15 meters into the air. And that night, from that fountain, the entire history of oil in the Middle East began. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company appeared. In 1913, Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, made the decision to convert the British fleet from coal to oil, and the British Admiralty bought a controlling stake in the company. Iranian oil, in the literal sense, began to move the warships of the British Empire. For Iran, this turned into a paradox that would haunt the country throughout the 20th century. The more valuable you become to the world, the less you are able to influence that world. Those same 16% of profits stipulated in the Darcy concession turned out in practice to be even more modest than they seemed on paper. Because Anglo-Persian calculated profit by its own rules, deducting royalties, taxes paid in Britain, and other items that the Iranian side could neither verify nor challenge. A country beneath whose soil one of the world's largest oil deposits was stored had neither leverage over extraction, nor transparency in the calculations, nor the ability to say no. It is precisely here that an economic question turned into a question of dignity. If the country's greatest wealth lies beneath our soil, why do others dispose of it? That question is not going anywhere. It will sound again and again, through Mossadegh, through the revolution, all the way to the present day. Countries that have lived through humiliation have an almost universal political instinct. They begin searching not for compromise, but for strength, not for a reformer, but for a man who will gather the state into a fist. In 1921, that man became Reza Khan, commander of the Cossack Brigade, essentially the only combat-capable military unit in the country. In February 1921, he entered Tehran with several thousand soldiers and took power, without bloodshed, almost without resistance. In 1925, Parliament voted to liquidate the Qajar monarchy, and Reza Khan proclaimed himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding a new dynasty. He should not be portrayed as a caricature. Reza Shah was a man of his time, the era of Ataturk in Turkey, of Mustafa Nahas in Egypt, when many Eastern societies tried to escape backwardness through a harsh state. For him, weakness of power did not mean freedom, but an invitation to foreign interference. What exactly did he do? And this is important to understand in detail. He built the Trans-Iranian Railway, 1,400 kilometers of track from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, completed in 1938. This was not just an infrastructure project, it was a demonstration. Iran now had a backbone. Construction took more than 11 years, and the project was financed not with foreign loans, deliberately, but with an internal tax on tea and sugar. He reformed the army. When Reza Khan came to power, Iran's army was a collection of regional militias, personally loyal to their commanders, not to the state. He created a conscript army, introduced a single uniform, and established military academies. By the end of his reign, the army numbered about 100,000 men. He carried out a large-scale secularization. In 1928, a unified civil code was introduced, pushing Sharia courts into the sphere of personal law. In 1936, wearing the chador was officially banned. Policemen literally tore veils from women in the streets. It was a painful reform that many perceived as violence against their way of life, not as liberation. In 1935, the country officially changed its name. Instead of Persia, international documents now used Iran. Reza Shah explained this by saying that Iran was the country's original self-name from Ariana, land of the Aryans, whereas Persia was the Greek name of only one of its provinces. Behind this symbolic step stood a clear message. We decide for ourselves what we are called. But all this strength had a price. Reza Shah was building not a state of dialogue, but a state of submission. Political parties were banned. The independent press was liquidated. Any opposition was crushed. Tribal chiefs unwilling to submit to the center were arrested or killed. The clergy, which resisted secularization, was pushed to the margins of public life. And then history taught yet another cruel lesson. In 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked the USSR, Britain and the Soviet Union urgently needed a corridor for transporting cargo. The Trans-Iranian Railway, the very one that Reza Shah had built as a symbol of independence, was perfectly suited for those purposes. Iran declared neutrality. That turned out not to be enough. The Allies demanded that German specialists and technical advisors working in the country be expelled. Reza Shah refused to carry out the ultimatum in full. On August 25, 1941, Soviet troops entered from the north, British troops from the south. Resistance was crushed in 3 days. In September, Reza Shah abdicated and was exiled first to Mauritius, then to South Africa, where he died in 1944. A ruler who had devoted his life to strengthening the state, who built an army, roads, and bureaucracy, was removed at the moment his course ceased to suit those who were stronger. The conclusion Iranian elites drew from this was harsh. Internal strength alone is not enough. The problem lies in the very structure of the world, where Iran is still not allowed to fully belong to itself. After Reza Shah's abdication, his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was not yet even 22 years old, ascended the throne. The political atmosphere softened sharply. Parties, the press, and public debate came alive. But that openness only exposed all the old cracks with renewed force. At the center of those cracks, oil once again found itself. By 1950, the terms of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company concession, that was what it was now called, were openly unfair by the standards of the time. The company paid Iran about 16 to 20 cents out of every dollar of profit. At the same time, the British government, which owned a controlling stake in AIOC, received more from it in taxes than Iran did in royalties. Iranian workers at the oil facilities of Abadan, the largest oil refinery in the world at that moment, lived in barracks without running water, while British specialists lived in separate houses with gardens, swimming pools, and clubs closed to Iranians. For comparison, in 1950, the American company Aramco signed a 50-50 profit-sharing agreement with Saudi Arabia. The Iranians demanded the same. AIOC offered slightly improved terms, but not parity. The negotiations reached a dead end. Against that backdrop, Mohammad Mossadegh appeared. He cannot be understood as just another prime minister. Coming from an aristocratic family, educated in law in Paris and Neuchâtel, a convinced constitutionalist, imprisoned several times under Reza Shah for refusing to cooperate with the regime, he was a politician of rare honesty in a system where honesty was a luxury. In April 1951, Parliament voted for the nationalization of AIOC, and Mossadegh became prime minister with a mandate to bring that decision to life. For millions of Iranians, this was not just an economic step. When in May 1951, the Iranian flag was raised above the Anglo-Iranian buildings in Abadan, people cried in the streets. What had symbolized dependence for decades was supposed to become a symbol of dignity. Britain responded immediately and harshly. It withdrew its technical specialists, without whom the Iranians initially could not fully manage oil refining. It organized an international boycott. Not a single major oil company bought Iranian oil under threat of lawsuits. It froze Iranian assets in British banks. It sent a war cruiser to Iran's shores. The country's oil exports fell almost to zero. The economy began to suffocate. At first, the United States did not share the British harshness. The Truman administration understood that the oil terms were indeed unfair and tried several times to mediate. But the situation was changing. In 1952, Eisenhower came to power, for whom every crisis in the Third World was read first and foremost as a question of the Cold War. And meanwhile, the influence of Tudeh, the local communist party linked to the USSR, was growing in Iran. To Washington, this was beginning to look like a warning. In August 1953, Mossadegh was overthrown in the course of an operation that the CIA called TPAJAX and British intelligence MI6 called Operation Boot. The U.S. State Department officially acknowledged participation in the coup. The relevant documents were declassified and published. The concrete mechanics of the coup are well known today. CIA officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, personally directed the operation from Tehran. By various estimates, between $1 and $5 million were spent bribing members of parliament, religious figures, newspaper editors, and street leaders. Organized crowds staged unrest, creating the appearance of popular dissatisfaction with Mossadegh. Army officers loyal to the Shah arrested the prime minister. Mossadegh was convicted of treason and spent 3 years in prison and the final years of his life under house arrest on his estate. He died in 1967, never having been rehabilitated. The Shah, who had fled to Rome a few days before the coup, returned to Tehran on an American airplane. From Washington's point of view, the logic was clear. CIA Director Allen Dulles and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles persuaded Eisenhower, if Iran sank into chaos, Tudeh would fill the vacuum. The oil fields would fall under Soviet influence. That would change the balance in the Cold War. But history is not remembered the way planners explain it. It is remembered the way people lived through it. And for Iranians, the meaning of 1953 was utterly simple. The only democratically elected leader who tried to return control of its main resource to the country was overthrown with the direct participation of the United States. Not because he threatened American citizens, not because he was preparing a war, but because his policy interfered with foreign interests. Before that, Iran already had distrust toward outside powers, toward spheres of influence, toward British and Russian pressure. But that distrust was directed, as if into emptiness, at faceless great powers. After 1953, historical interference acquired a specific name and a specific date. From that moment on, any future conflict with America could rely not on an abstraction, but on a living example. Here is the moment when they already decided for us. And the rhetoric about the freedom of peoples, about the right of nations to self-determination, all of this now sounded different. The words remained. Trust in them disappeared. After the coup, the Shah returned, but already in a different role. His power was now inseparable from American support. To Washington, this looked like the restoration of stability. To the Shah's opponents, like the beginning of a new dependency. The concrete scale of the American presence in the Shah's Iran is hard to overestimate. In 1957, with the direct participation of the CIA in Israel's Mossad, the secret police, Savak, was created. By the mid-1970s, according to various estimates, it employed between 15,000 and 60,000 full-time staff and agents, and its network of informers had penetrated universities, mosques, factories, and student organizations abroad. Amnesty International in 1975 called Iran a country with the highest number of political executions in the world and one of the cruelest practices of torture. In 1973, the oil crisis occurred, and Iran's oil revenues rose from $2.4 billion in 1972 to nearly $18 billion in 1974. The Shah spent that money on an imperial scale. In the United States alone, between 1970 and 1978, Iran purchased more than $20 billion worth of weapons, F-14 Tomcat fighter jets, helicopters, tanks, destroyers. The number of American military advisors and technical specialists in the country stood at around 40,000. With Nixon's support, Iran was conceived as the regional gendarme of the Persian Gulf. a country that would ensure stability in the region instead of American troops. It would be dishonest to deny the real achievements of that era. Literacy rose from about 15% in the 1950s to more than 50% by the end of the 1970s. The Literacy Corps was created, sending teachers to villages. Average life expectancy increased from roughly 45 to 55 years. Tehran turned into a modern metropolis with a metro, universities, and skyscrapers. The White Revolution, a package of reforms announced in the 1963 referendum, included land reform, women's suffrage, the liquidation of feudal privileges, and a program of forest nationalization. The reforms were real, but they were carried out from above, without society's political participation, and they destroyed traditional structures faster than they created new ones. Peasants who received plots under the land reform often had neither access to credit, nor irrigation, nor markets, and were forced to sell their land and move to the cities. Tehran was growing at a speed its infrastructure could not keep up with. Urban slums were populated by millions of people torn out of their familiar way of life. In December 1977, Jimmy Carter at a New Year's dinner in Tehran called Iran an island of stability in one of the world's most troubled regions, and raised a toast to the Shah. Less than a year later, the country was engulfed by revolution. It was exactly here that the main paradox emerged. The closer Iran became to the United States as a state, the stronger the feeling grew in society that America was the pillar of an unjust order. Anti-Americanism was born not in isolation from American influence, but inside the very era of a close alliance with America. How could a regime with an army, oil revenues, a powerful security apparatus, and the support of a superpower collapse? States do not collapse when they grow poor. They collapse when people stop believing in them. The turning point was Black Friday, September 8, 1978. But to understand why thousands of people came out onto Jaleh Square that morning, one has to understand what had been happening in the country throughout the entire preceding year. By 1978, dissatisfaction with the regime had been building up simultaneously in several layers of society. Religious circles were embittered by years of secularization policy, restrictions on the activity of the clergy, the closure of religious schools, mockery of the traditional way of life in the state press. The urban intelligentsia and students were suffocating from censorship and political repression. Any opposition organization was immediately crushed by SAVAK. The commercial middle class, bazaar merchants, small entrepreneurs, was irritated by the Shah's economic policy, which opened the market to large Western corporations, but squeezed traditional Iranian business. Workers and the urban poor suffered from inflation. Oil revenues were rising, but prices were rising faster. Housing in the cities had become unaffordable, and the gap between rich and poor was visible to the naked eye. The catalyst was a publication in January 1978. The state newspaper Etila'at printed an article in which Khomeini, by then already living in exile for 15 years, was accused of ties to Iran's foreign enemies and described in insulting terms. For believing Iranians, this was a deliberate spit in the face. The next day, students of religious schools took to the streets in the holy city of Qom. The police opened fire. Several people were killed. After that, the logic of the Shiite mourning ritual kicked in, a logic the Shah apparently did not fully understand or underestimated. In Shiite Islam, it is customary to mark the 40th day after the death of a martyr. Chehelom. 40 days after Qom, new demonstrations took place in Tabriz. More dead again. 40 days later, the next wave, this time across the entire country. The protests spread like a pulse, a blow, a pause, a stronger blow. By September 1978, this was no longer a spontaneous riot, but an organized mass movement. On September 7th, a huge demonstration took place in Tehran, by some estimates, several 100,000 people. Sensing the threat, the Shah imposed martial law in Tehran and 11 other cities. This decision was announced late at night. On the morning of September 8th, some demonstrators simply did not know about martial law. The information had not reached everyone in time. Others knew, but came deliberately. Thousands gathered in Jaleh Square. The army cordoned off the square. An order to disperse was given. The crowd did not disperse. The military opened fire. The exact number of dead remains disputed to this day. The official figures of the Shah's government were around 80 people. The opposition cited figures in the several hundreds. The revolutionary government later spoke of thousands. That figure was, in all likelihood, politically inflated. But even the official 80 killed in a single day in the center of the capital meant that there was no return. After Black Friday, compromise between the regime and the street became practically impossible. Strikes swept through the oil industry. The Shah offered liberalization, replaced several prime ministers, released political prisoners, but every gesture was now perceived no longer as reform, but as weakness. The movement that had begun with an insulting newspaper article in January turned into a revolution in less than half a year. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran. Officially, on vacation. He would never return to the country. By the mid-1970s, the Shah's regime had everything that is usually considered a sign of solidity. It lacked one thing: political and moral legitimacy. For some, the Shah was a traitor to tradition. For others, an authoritarian break. For still others, a symbol of social inequality. For a fourth group, a man too obviously sustained by external patronage. These different resentments converged in one conclusion: the regime no longer speaks in the name of the country. When that happens, even a large apparatus of repression begins to malfunction. Fear stops working, because in the eyes of society, the price of preserving the regime exceeds the price of risk. It would be far too simple to describe the revolution of 1979 as the victory of religion over modernization. It was a coalition that, under other circumstances, would never have gathered at the same table. To understand why such different people ended up on the same side of the barricades, one has to look at what each group hated in the regime and what each clung to as hope. Religious circles had been accumulating resentments for decades. The White Revolution of 1963 struck the clergy in several places at once. Land reform affected religious endowments, waqfs, that had for centuries supported mosques, madrasas, and religious leaders. A new law allowed women to vote in local elections. Khomeini regarded this as a violation of Islamic principles. In 1975, the Shah abolished the multi-party system and created a single party, Rastakiz, requiring all Iranians, including the clergy, to join it. From Iraq, Khomeini publicly called for a boycott of the party. It was an open challenge. The left and the nationalists, the Tudi party of Iran, the Fedayeen, the Mujahideen, hated the regime for other reasons. For them, the Shah was a comprador ruler who opened the country to Western capital and placed American interests above Iranian ones. They remembered 1953 and Mossadegh and saw in the Shah a direct continuation of that story. Many of them spent years in Savak prisons, where electric shocks, mock drowning, and sleep deprivation were used as torture. The commercial middle class, the bazaris, the traditional traders of Tehran's and other bazaars, had been a pillar of the Iranian economy for centuries and were historically closely tied to the clergy. It was the bazaris who financed mosques and religious education. The Shah had irritated them for a long time, but finally fell out with them in 1975 when he declared a crusade against speculators and bribe takers. A wave of arrests of traders swept across the country. Tens of thousands of people received fines, prison sentences, and trading bans. This was declared to be a fight against inflation. In reality, a blow against those who had never especially liked the Shah anyway. Urban youth and students by the end of the 1970s represented a demographic bomb. The Shah's modernization programs sharply increased the number of universities, from one University of Tehran in the 1940s to more than 20 by the end of the 1970s. Hundreds of thousands of young people were receiving an education, but were not finding jobs corresponding to their qualifications. Politically, they were completely deprived of a voice. There were no independent trade unions, no student associations, no opposition parties. All that energy had nowhere to go. Against the background of all this, Khomeini's figure acquired an almost mythical dimension, and not by accident. By that moment, Khomeini had spent 15 years in exile, first in Turkey, then in Najaf in Iraq. Then from October 1978 onward, near Paris in Pontchartrain. From exile, he spread his messages through cassette tapes. Recordings of his sermons and speeches were copied and spread throughout Iran through the network of mosques. This was the first revolution in history that was, to a large extent, made by audio cassettes. The Shah controlled newspapers, television, and radio, but he could not control a suitcase full of cassettes carried across the border or passed from hand to hand. Khomeini possessed a rare political instinct. He deliberately spoke in a language understandable to everyone at once. To the left, he spoke about the struggle against imperialism and injustice. To nationalists, about sovereignty and dignity. To believers, about the defense of Islam. At the same time, he spoke evasively in public interviews about the concrete form of the future state, about vilayat-e-faqih, about theocracy. In his famous interview with French journalists, he described his future in Iran almost idyllically. "I will return to Qom and devote myself to teaching." Many of his allies, liberals, intellectuals, nationalists, believed him. America in this picture was turning into the sign of the entire system of outside interference. Khomeini called the United States the Great Satan, and that was not just rhetoric. Behind this image stood a concrete historical argument. It was America that in 1953 helped break the only Iranian experience of democratic sovereignty. It was America that supplied the Shah with weapons and political support for decades. It was Americans who created SAVAK and trained its personnel. A journalist on board the plane asked him, "What do you feel returning home?" Khomeini answered, "Nothing." That answer was later quoted in every possible way, as evidence of asceticism, as a riddle, as a sign of coldness. But perhaps he was telling the truth. For him, this was not a sentimental moment. It was the beginning of work. On February 11, 1979, the Supreme Military Council declared the army neutral. That meant the end. Without the army, the Shah's regime did not exist. On that same day, revolutionary committees seized key buildings all across Tehran. The Islamic Republic had begun. But inside the victorious coalition, a struggle immediately began over what exactly this republic would become. The liberals, led by Mehdi Bazargan, who became the first prime minister, wanted a constitutional state with Islamic values, but Western institutions. The left wanted socialist reforms. Khomeini and his circle wanted theocracy. Over the next several years, the Islamists methodically pushed everyone else aside. First the liberals, then the left. Many of those who made the revolution ended up in prison or executed under the new regime. The revolution devoured its own children, as it almost always does. To understand why the students seized the American embassy, one has to understand the atmosphere of Tehran in the autumn of 1979, an atmosphere in which the revolution had not yet decided on its own face, and each faction was trying to prove that it was the most consistent one. Revolutions in their first year live in a special condition. The enemy has been defeated, but the fear of counter-revolution does not pass. It grows stronger because now there is something to lose. In Iran, that fear had a concrete historical basis. In 1953, it was precisely the American embassy that became the headquarters of the coup against Mossadegh. CIA officer Kermit Roosevelt worked from there. Agents bribing members of parliament and hiring street gangs were coordinated from there. For Iranians who knew this story, and after the revolution everyone knew it, the American embassy in Tehran was not a diplomatic institution. It was a place from which the Iranian government had already once been overthrown. In October 1979, Jimmy Carter made a decision that turned out to be fatal. The terminally ill Shah needed medical care, which according to his entourage, could only be obtained in the United States. The State Department objected. It would provoke a crisis. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger pressured Carter. Refusing the Shah entry would mean betraying an ally. Carter hesitated for several months, then agreed. To revolutionary Tehran, this looked like a signal. The Shah in New York meant the Americans were protecting him. If they were protecting him, then they were preparing for counter-revolution. On November 4, 1979, a group of students calling themselves Muslim students following the Imam's line climbed over the embassy wall. At first, this did not look like a pre-planned state action, rather like a radical student initiative. But Khomeini did not condemn the seizure. He supported it, and that changed everything. 66 American citizens ended up in captivity. The first days were chaotic. The captors did not fully understand what to do next. The hostages were kept in different rooms, and their fate was unclear. 13 people, women and African Americans, were released in the first weeks. Khomeini declared that those groups themselves were victims of American imperialism. One hostage was released on medical grounds. The remaining 52 stayed. What happened next can be described as a crisis that everyone won, except the hostages and the American president. For Khomeini, the seizure of the embassy became an instrument of domestic political struggle with surgical precision. Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan, who had been trying to build pragmatic relations with the West, met with Brzezinski in Algiers a few days before the seizure. When that became known against the background of the embassy crisis, his political position became impossible. 3 days after the seizure, Bazargan resigned. The moderate wing of the revolution lost its main figure. Meanwhile, the students methodically sorted through the seized embassy archives. The CIA managed to destroy part of the documents, but not everything. Embassy staff did not expect to have so little time. Torn documents were glued back together by hand or reconstructed. The results were published in the multi-volume edition, Documents from the U.S. Espionage Den, Documents from the Lair of American Espionage. The publication showed the real scale of American contacts with Iranian politicians, journalists, and military officers. Some of the people named there were arrested, others fled the country. In the United States, the crisis paralyzed Carter's administration. The president focused on the fate of the hostages almost to the point of self-abasement. He canceled campaign trips, publicly demonstrated concern, and began each day with a briefing on the situation. Politically, it was suicide. The three main television networks opened their evening news broadcasts with a counter of the days of captivity. American society watched a superpower be powerless. In April 1980, an attempt was made at a forceful rescue, Operation Eagle Claw. 8 helicopters were supposed to enter Iran, reach Tehran, rescue the hostages, and fly back out. The operation collapsed in the desert. 2 helicopters broke down because of sandstorms, and a third collided with a transport plane during refueling. 8 American servicemen were killed. The charred remains of the helicopters were shown by the Iranian authorities before cameras as trophies. For Carter, this meant the end. In the presidential election of November 1980, he lost to Reagan by a landslide. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, after 444 days since the seizure. Literally a few minutes after Reagan took the oath. The plane with the released hostages took off from Tehran while the inauguration ceremony had not yet ended. The version that Reagan's team secretly agreed with Tehran to delay the release until the change of president, in order to deprive Carter of that victory, was never conclusively proven, but it was never disproven either. A U.S. Congressional Commission investigated the matter in 1992 and found no convincing evidence, which did not mean such evidence did not exist. Thus, 444 days of humiliating a superpower became part of American national memory, no less solid than 1953 in Iranian memory. Each side now had its own date, its own image of betrayal, its own proof of why the other side could not be trusted. One could have assumed that, with time, the emotions would settle and the relationship would enter at least a mode of cold pragmatism. The opposite happened. Each following decade added a new layer to the already existing enmity. The first test was war. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi troops crossed the Iranian border on several fronts at once. Saddam Hussein counted on a quick victory. Iran was engulfed in revolutionary chaos, and the army's officer corps had been decapitated. Hundreds of officers who had served under the Shah were shot or thrown into prison as potential counter-revolutionaries. Saddam expected Iran to collapse within a few weeks. He miscalculated. The war dragged on for 8 years and turned into one of the bloodiest in the history of the second half of the 20th century. According to various estimates, Iran lost between 300,000 and 500,000 people killed. Iraq, a comparable number. Millions were wounded or maimed. The economic damage of both countries was measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. Iran fought under conditions of international isolation. The United States, the Soviet Union, France, most Arab states, all in one way or another supported Iraq. Washington restored diplomatic relations with Baghdad in 1984, provided intelligence on Iranian positions, and organized credit lines for the purchase of equipment. American satellite images of Iranian positions arrived at Saddam's headquarters regularly. A special page in this story is the use of chemical weapons. The Iraqi army used mustard gas and nerve agents against Iranian troops systematically beginning in 1983. The best-known attack took place in March 1988 in the Kurdish town of Halabja. Between 3,000 and 5,000 civilians were killed. The United States knew about this. Secret documents declassified later show that American intelligence recorded the use of chemical weapons and did not stop passing intelligence to the Iraqis. Washington feared an Iranian victory more than Iraq's violation of international law. For the Iranian leadership, this war became the formative experience of the new state. It entrenched several convictions that would define Iranian policy for decades to come. The West applies double standards. International institutions, the UN, international law, conventions on chemical weapons, work only when it is beneficial to the strong. A country unable to defend itself by its own means is always vulnerable. It is precisely out of this experience, and not out of abstract ideology, that the logic of Iran's nuclear program grows. Iran's nuclear history began without any anti-American logic whatsoever. In 1957, Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program, it was the United States that helped the Shah build Iran's first research nuclear reactor. The Tehran Nuclear Center was launched in 1967 with American highly enriched uranium. Iran signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. After the revolution of 1979, the program was frozen. At first, Khomeini considered nuclear weapons incompatible with Islamic ethics. But the Iran-Iraq War, in which Iraq used chemical weapons with the West's silent indulgence, changed that perception. The Iranian leadership drew the conclusion: a country without weapons of deterrence remains vulnerable. In 2002, an Iranian opposition group revealed the existence of secret nuclear facilities, a uranium enrichment plant in Natanz, and a heavy water production plant in Iraq. A crisis lasting many years began. Negotiations alternated with sanctions, sanctions with negotiations. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was signed. Iran agreed sharply to limit uranium enrichment and allow expanded international oversight in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. In 2018, Trump unilaterally withdrew from the agreement and imposed sanctions even harsher than before. In January 2020, an American drone strike killed General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force and, in essence, the chief architect of Iranian regional influence. Tehran responded with a missile strike on American bases in Iraq. The logic of the dispute reproduces the logic of the past. In the era of Mossadegh, the question sounded like this: can Iran control its own oil? Today it sounds differently. Can Iran define the limits of its own defensive and technological independence? In substance, different spheres. In historical logic, almost the same thing. At the same time, Iran is turning more and more actively toward Russia and China. In 2021, Tehran and Beijing signed a 25-year strategic partnership agreement. In exchange for Chinese investment and support, Iran committed itself to supplying oil at preferential prices. Russia and Iran are drawing closer against the backdrop of the Ukrainian crisis. Iranian Shahed drones are being used by Russian forces. This is not an alliance of equals and not a union of values. It is mutually beneficial cooperation between states united by a shared confrontation with Western pressure. The United States and Iran became enemies not because they were doomed to this from the very beginning, and not because one people, by nature, hates the other. They became enemies because, step by step, they created such a history of relations in which each new chapter strengthened the old resentment and the old fear. For Iran, everything began long before America, with the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which divided the country without its participation, with the Darcy Concession and 16% from Iranian oil. with Reza Shah's abdication under Allied pressure, with Mossadegh and Operation Teepajax, with Savak and 40,000 American advisors, with Black Friday and the fall of the Shah. Each of these episodes, taken separately, could have been recovered from. Together, they formed a narrative that reproduces itself. For the United States, Iran means 444 days of hostages, 8 dead soldiers in the Iranian desert, Hezbollah attacks backed by Tehran, a missile strike on American bases, decades of anti-American rhetoric elevated to the rank of state ideology. That is how one of the most durable enmities of the modern world emerged. Not an enmity of interests, an enmity of memory. And such conflicts live longer than generations, because every new crisis only confirms the old story of why the other side cannot be trusted. Thanks for watching. Please like it. Subscribe to keep up with Nation by Nation.